The ivory silk dragged across the stone floor of the chapel. My sister stood at the altar, holding a bouquet of desert wildflowers, wearing the vintage Dior gown I had spent months restoring. She smiled for the photographer, turning her shoulder so the morning sunlight caught the hand-tatted lace sleeves. My mother stood in the front row, whispering loud enough for the guests to hear that I should just let my sister have this moment. I was supposed to be the bride today. Instead, I was standing in the center aisle wearing faded blue jeans and work boots. I watched the audacity of my own blood play out in real time. I did not yell. I did not cry. I just watched Pastor Dave step up to the microphone, signal the string quartet to stop playing, and reach his hand deep inside a hidden seam in the hem of that stolen dress. When he pulled out a sealed plastic sleeve and read the handwritten note inside, my sister's victorious smirk died right there on the altar. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance. I'm Amelia. I'm 32. This is the story of how my family tried to bury my happiness so my sister could shine, and what happened when I finally stopped paying for their spotlight. How old are you, and what is the hardest boundary you have ever had to draw with your own blood? Drop your age and your story in the comments. 14 months before I watched my sister unravel in front of God and 100 guests, I was just a woman trying to keep the peace. I run an estate liquidation firm out of Scottsdale, Arizona. My job consists of sorting through the physical wreckage people leave behind when they die or go bankrupt. I inventory tarnished silver. I catalog antique credenzas. I empty desert mansions filled with bad memories and unpaid tax notices. It is a meticulous, quiet profession. You learn to look past the shiny surface and see the rot underneath. I learned how to do it because I spent my entire life practicing on my own family. You learn to spot structural damage early when you grow up in a house built on a foundation of enabling. The trouble started with a garment bag. Our late grandmother left behind a cedar chest when she passed. Inside was her 1970s Christian Dior wedding gown. When I first pulled it out of the dark wood, the fabric smelled of dry rot and mothballs. The heavy ivory silk carried decades of yellow stains along the collar and the hem. Harper took one look at it and laughed. Harper is 29. She lists her occupation as digital creator on her tax returns. That is a polite way of saying she posts videos of aesthetic iced lattes from expensive coffee shops while dodging calls from debt collectors. She walked into the room carrying a designer handbag I knew her credit card company was currently hunting her for. She called the vintage Dior a dusty tragedy and told me to throw it in a donation bin. She said no one wanted to look like a ghost on their wedding day. But I saw the architecture of the bodice. I saw the bones of the thing. I took the gown to a textile specialist in downtown Phoenix. I spent $3,400 of my own money to bring it back to life. I worked extra weekend liquidation sales, clearing out dusty garages in the July heat, just to pay for the delicate chemical baths and the reweaving of the tatted lace. The seamstress delivered the revived gown on a Tuesday afternoon. The stains were gone. The fabric possessed a rich pearlescent sheen that seemed to glow in the ambient light of my living room. I hung it on a reinforced hook by the window, admiring the long, elegant lines of the skirt. The front door swung open. Harper rarely knocked. She dropped her keys on my kitchen counter. The heavy clank of metal against granite broke the quiet of my apartment. She froze. The sneer she usually reserved for my projects vanished. A calculating, hungry stare replaced it. She walked straight to the window, unzipped the protective bag, and pulled the heavy silk against her chest. She turned toward the hallway mirror, tilting her chin to catch the afternoon light. "You know," she murmured, her eyes tracking her own reflection, "ivory washes out your complexion, Amelia, but it makes my skin pop. Look at how the waistline hits me." I stood by the kitchen island and pressed my fingernails into my palm. Just yesterday, my checking account had automatically drafted her $180 car insurance premium. I covered it silently every single month, because last week, she claimed she needed preventative Botox to secure a skincare sponsorship and could not afford her bills. She was currently standing in a living room that my labor paid for, holding a dress I restored with my own sweat, critiquing the body of the woman funding her entire existence. "It is tailored to my exact measurements, Harper," I said. I kept my voice flat, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. She let out a breathy sigh and ran her manicured fingers over the vintage lace. "Right, but you have that boxy shape. I have the hips for this era of couture. It is a shame to waste a piece of fashion history on someone who cannot fill it out right." I did not argue. Arguing with Harper was like wrestling a shadow. You just end up exhausted with nothing to show for it. I walked over, took the velvet hanger from her grip, and pulled the zipper up past the collar. I trapped the ivory silk back inside the dark vinyl bag. "It is not a rental," I told her. Harper rolled her eyes. She grabbed her phone from the counter and walked out, muttering about my lack of sisterly spirit. The door clicked shut, but the silence in my apartment felt heavy. The scent of her expensive floral perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the faint, clean smell of the freshly pressed silk. Estate liquidators know how to read the signs of impending collapse. You look at a hairline crack in the drywall, and you know the earth is shifting beneath the house. The way she looked at that silk was not just casual sibling envy. It was a claim of ownership. I thought I had zipped the problem away in a garment bag. I did not know she had already decided to take my wedding for herself, and that my mother was going to hand her the keys to do it. Lucas walked into my apartment smelling of sterile alcohol wipes and exhausted adrenaline. He is 34 years old. He drives an ambulance through the heat of the Sonoran Desert, pulling people out of wrecked vehicles and stabilizing cardiac arrests on the asphalt. He deals in actual life-or-death emergencies. Because he spends his days managing genuine crises, he possesses a rare clarity. When he looked at my family, he recognized the triage hierarchy instantly. He was the first person to sit at my kitchen table, watch my mother ask me to pay my sister's past due utility bills, and call the dynamic exactly what it was: a hostage situation, where the captors convince you that paying the ransom is an act of love. 3 months before my wedding date, the hostage takers arrived unannounced. Lucas and I were reviewing the catering menu on a Tuesday evening when Harper pushed the front door open. A man named Bryce followed a few steps behind her. Bryce was a local club promoter she had been dating for exactly 16 weeks. He possessed the nervous, shifting energy of a man who did not quite know the script he was supposed to be reading. Harper shoved her left hand into my face before I could even offer them a glass of water. A diamond ring refracted the kitchen pendant lights, throwing sharp glints across the ceiling. She announced they were getting married. I looked at the ring. I looked at Bryce, who offered a tight, apologetic shrug from the entryway. I offered my congratulations. I poured the champagne. Estate liquidators know that sudden, flashy acquisitions usually hide a mountain of debt or a desperate need for attention. Harper did not come over to share joy. She came over to shoplift my planning. She sat on my velvet sofa, crossed her legs, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. She took a sip of champagne and declared she was throwing a lavish engagement gala to introduce Bryce to the Arizona social scene. She picked the date. It was the second Saturday in May. I stared at her over the rim of my glass. The second Saturday in May was the date of my bridal shower, the shower she was supposed to be attending as my maid of honor. She waved her hand dismissively, stating we could just do a joint celebration, where she got the evening slot to host her friends. Then she tapped her manicured nail against the leather notebook. She needed the contact information for my florist. My floral vendor was an exclusive botanical artist in Sedona. She specialized in structural desert arrangements. She designed sprawling pieces using ghost succulents, flowering agave, dried cholla wood, and imported white protea. She booked out 2 years in advance. I spent 6 months negotiating my contract with her, curating a specific vision of muted desert tones to match the vintage Dior silk. Harper wanted her for the engagement gala. She wanted the exact same centerpieces. I set my champagne flute down. The crystal clinked against the granite counter, breaking the expectant silence. I told her no. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Harper blinked. She looked at Bryce, waiting for him to defend her, but Bryce was suddenly very interested in the texture of my living room rug. I explained the reality of the situation. My florist was a solo artist, not a commercial warehouse. She could not physically execute a 200-person gala and prep for my wedding in the same month. Beyond the logistics, I was not sharing my design palette for a party scheduled on the night of my own bridal shower. The tears arrived with professional speed. Harper's lower lip trembled. Her breathing hitched, creating a staccato rhythm of manufactured panic. She stood up, her voice rising an octave. She called me a selfish gatekeeper. She accused me of trying to sabotage her happiness because I could not stand sharing the spotlight. She wept, clutching her chest, playing the victim with the kind of theatrical precision that deserves a bronze trophy. My phone buzzed on the counter. Then it buzzed again. Beverly was calling. My mother always hovered on the periphery of Harper's meltdowns, ready to deploy the guilt trip the moment I tried to hold a line. 10 years ago, my father walked out the front door with a packed duffel bag. He left behind a handwritten note on the dining table and an underwater mortgage on a house in Mesa. He vanished into a new life in another state, and the financial floor fell out from under us. I was 22. I dropped out of my master's program. I took 3 jobs. I paid the mortgage arrears so the bank would not take the house. I bought the groceries. I became the anchor. Beverly learned a dangerous lesson that year. She learned that if she panicked loudly enough, Amelia would step in and write the check. She claimed frail nerves and refused to work. Every time Harper created chaos, Beverly turned her anxious, tear-filled eyes to me, expecting me to smooth the rough edges of reality so Harper never had to feel the scrape. Harper stormed out of the apartment, dragging Bryce by the sleeve of his jacket. The front door slammed. The apartment fell into a ringing silence. My jaw ached. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, feeling the familiar, exhausting pressure building at the base of my skull. The phone continued to vibrate against the granite. Beverly texting, Beverly calling, the screen illuminated with paragraphs of pleading text. She begged me to just call the florist. She begged me to just give Harper this one little victory. She begged me to be the bigger person to keep the family intact. I ground my teeth together. The friction sent a sharp pain through my jawline. Lucas walked over from the dining table. He did not ask what happened. He did not offer useless platitudes about family loyalty. He reached out with his calloused hands and placed his palms over mine. His touch was steady, radiating the calm focus of a man who spends his days stabilizing trauma. He slid the vibrating phone across the counter, moving the glowing screen out of my peripheral vision. He looked at the tension locked in my shoulders. "You do not have to answer the ring," he said. His voice was low and even. "You are off the clock, Amelia. Let them panic without you." I leaned against his chest, inhaling the scent of antiseptic and safety. He was right. I did not answer the phone. I let the screen go dark. I poured the rest of the champagne down the kitchen sink. I thought refusing to hand over a phone number was the end of the negotiation. I thought boundaries were lines you drew in the sand that people eventually respected. I forgot that a hostage taker does not ask for the keys when they can just pick the lock. If I would not hand the vendor over to Harper, my mother was simply going to take the vendor from me. Beverly summoned me for lunch 2 days after the incident in my apartment. She chose a French bistro in Old Town Scottsdale, a place featuring wrought iron patio chairs and overhead misting fans that sprayed tepid water into the dry desert air. My mother is 62 years old. She weaponizes pastel cardigans and a soft, trembling voice, projecting an aura of maternal fragility that makes anyone who denies her look like a monster. I arrived 10 minutes early. Beverly arrived 15 minutes late, carrying a designer tote bag she purchased with the emergency credit card I co-signed for her years ago. She slid into the chair across from me, sighing heavily as she smoothed her linen trousers. She ordered an iced lemonade and stirred it slowly. The ice cubes clinked against the tall glass, keeping a nervous metallic rhythm. She did not ask about my wedding planning. She did not ask how Lucas was handling his grueling paramedic shifts. She skipped the pleasantries and went straight to the extraction. "Harper is drowning right now," Beverly murmured, keeping her eyes fixed on the lemon slice bobbing in her drink. Bryce comes from a very established family, Amelia. His parents belong to the Paradise Valley Country Club. Your sister feels terribly inadequate. She needs this engagement gala to prove she belongs in his world. I took a sip of my black coffee. The bitter taste coated my tongue. Harper chose to rush an engagement to a man she barely knows, I replied. That is her reality to manage. It does not constitute an emergency on my end. Beverly finally looked up. Her expression shifted from fragile to reproachful. She placed her hand over mine, her skin cool and damp from holding her glass. You are always so put together, Amelia. You have the stable career, you own your home, you have Lucas, your wedding is practically running itself. Harper just needs a win. Why is it so difficult for you to share your blessings? Just call the floral designer. Tell her to transfer your retainer to the gala. It is just a favor. I looked at the hand resting on top of mine. I looked at the woman who birthed me, a woman who genuinely believed that my stability was a communal resource to be plundered whenever her favorite daughter felt insecure. This was the mother's tax, the unspoken rule that the responsible child must constantly diminish their own light to keep the irresponsible child from noticing the dark. The answer is no, I said. I pulled my hand out from under hers. I paid a $1,500 deposit to secure my date. I spent 6 months curating that contract. I am not gifting my vendor to Harper. Beverly sat back in her wrought iron chair. The fragile mask slipped, revealing a rigid, brittle line of resentment across her jaw. You have always been so rigid, she whispered. Family requires sacrifice, Amelia. Someday you will learn that. She stood up, left a $20 bill on the table that did not even cover her drink, and walked away. I watched her navigate the crowded patio, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. I assumed the lunch was a failed negotiation. I assumed she would go back to Harper and deliver the bad news. I underestimated the sheer audacity of a parent who refuses to hear the word no. Thursday morning arrived with the quiet hum of the air conditioning unit in my home office. I sat at my mahogany desk reviewing my master wedding spreadsheet. I needed to upload a reference photo of a vintage lace pattern to the florist's client portal so she could match the bridal bouquet ribbon to the Dior gown. I clicked the bookmarked link. I typed in my email address and my password. The dashboard loaded. I stared at the screen. The pixelated text seemed to blur, then snap into sharp, agonizing focus. The event name at the top of the portal no longer read Alexander Wedding. It read Harper and Bryce Engagement Gala. The event date had shifted from my October wedding weekend to the second Saturday in May. The venue listed was a rented country club patio. The $1,500 retainer I paid with my own debit card was credited to the new invoice. A cold, leaden weight dropped into my stomach. My fingertips went numb. I picked up my phone and dialed the floral studio. The owner answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. I asked her why my event details were altered. A long pause echoed through the receiver. The owner sounded genuinely confused. She explained that I had called the studio yesterday afternoon. She said I sounded frantic, citing a severe family emergency. She said I begged her to pivot the retainer to a new date and a new location to salvage a ruined family celebration. How did you verify it was me? I asked, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper. The owner stammered, clearly sensing the rising tension. She said the caller verified the account using my exact birth date, my home address, and my mother's maiden name, Beverly. My mother did not just ask for a favor at the bistro. When I refused to surrender my security, she went home, picked up the telephone, and impersonated me. She used the intimate details of my life, the very facts that tethered me to her, to bypass a security protocol and steal my financial asset. She committed identity theft to fund Harper's vanity. The illusion of family loyalty did not just fracture in that moment. It shattered into a million microscopic pieces, turning into dust. For 10 years, I believed I was holding a broken family together. Staring at that computer screen, I realized I was not a daughter. I was a host organism. They were parasites feeding on my labor, my money, and my peace of mind. A normal person might have driven to their mother's house, kicked the front door open, and screamed until their throat bled. I am an estate liquidator. I deal in contracts, legal realities, and asset recovery. Anger is a messy, inefficient emotion. It clouds judgment. It gives the opposition a reason to call you hysterical. I did not shed a single tear. I felt nothing but a pristine, terrifying clarity. I thanked the florist for her time, apologizing for the confusion, and hung up the phone. I did not call Beverly. I did not text Harper. Instead, I dialed the toll-free number on the back of my bank card. I navigated the automated menus until I reached the fraud dispute department. A representative with a tired voice asked how he could assist me. I stated my name. I stated that an unauthorized third party had impersonated me to a merchant, altering a service contract and hijacking a $1,500 transaction. I filed a formal chargeback. I ordered the bank to freeze my current debit card and issue a new one with a different numerical sequence. Filing a chargeback meant the bank would forcibly pull those funds back from the floral studio. The florist, realizing she had been caught in the middle of a fraudulent transaction, would immediately cancel the engagement gala contract. Beverly and Harper were about to lose their prized vendor, and they were going to find out through a sterile cancellation email rather than a screaming match with me. But I was not finished. I opened a new tab on my browser. Through my estate liquidation network, I knew a private, unlisted floral designer operating out of Flagstaff. She did not have a public Instagram account to steal from. She worked exclusively through high-net-worth referrals. I called her, explained my vision, and wired her a new deposit from a separate secure account. Then I initiated a lockdown. I spent the next 2 hours calling every single vendor associated with my wedding: the caterer, the venue coordinator, the string quartet, the tailor altering the vintage Dior dress. I informed each of them that my family dynamics had become hostile. I established a verbal security password. The word was vintage. I instructed every vendor to immediately disconnect the line if anyone called attempting to change a date, cancel a service, or access my file without speaking that exact word. I closed my laptop. The trap was set. The perimeter was secured. I leaned back in my leather office chair, listening to the quiet hum of the house, waiting for the financial bomb I just armed to detonate in Harper's lap. The financial bomb detonated exactly 48 hours after I filed the bank dispute. It was a Friday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, organizing a catalog of mid-century modern furniture for an upcoming estate auction. My phone screen lit up. A notification appeared from a social media platform I rarely checked. Then another appeared. Then 6 more arrived in rapid succession. Harper had received the cancellation email from the floral studio. The designer informed her that the retainer was reported as fraudulent, and all services for the engagement gala were terminated. Harper did not call me to ask what happened. She knew what happened. Instead of confronting the truth, she weaponized her digital audience. I unlocked my phone and tapped the application. Harper had posted a long, tearful video. She sat in her luxury apartment, wearing an oversized sweater to look fragile, wiping dry eyes. She told her followers that her own sister was a jealous bridezilla who deliberately sabotaged her engagement party out of pure spite. She claimed I called her vendor and canceled her flowers just to ruin her happiness. The comments poured in, validating her victimhood. Within 10 minutes, the extended family mobilized. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Aunt Sarah texted to ask why I was being so cruel. Cousin Mark sent a paragraph demanding I apologize and fix the mess. The flying monkeys were doing exactly what flying monkeys do. They were rushing to protect the loudest, most volatile member of the tribe so they would not become the target of her wrath. I sat in the quiet glow of the kitchen pendant lights, reading the vitriol from people who had not spoken to me in months. The sheer volume of the messages should have induced a panic attack. A year ago, I would have drafted a dozen different apologies, desperate to clear my name. I would have paid double to reinstate the vendor just to stop the digital bleeding. But the air in my apartment felt different tonight. I turned the phone over, placing the glass screen against the granite countertop. The buzzing muted into a dull vibration against the stone. I walked into the living room. Lucas was asleep on the sofa. He had just finished a grueling 14-hour paramedic shift. His uniform boots sat neatly by the front door. His navy blue work shirt was draped over the armchair. He lay on his side, his chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence. I watched the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He spent his days pulling shattered people out of mangled cars on the interstate. He witnessed real tragedy. He understood the fragile, fleeting nature of human existence. I picked up a woven cotton blanket from the basket near the fireplace and draped it over his shoulders. He stirred slightly, leaning into the warmth, and settled back into a deep sleep. Standing over him, a profound realization anchored my feet to the hardwood floor. This was the life I wanted to build. A quiet sanctuary shared with a man who dealt in truth and healing. I wanted a marriage based on mutual support, not a circus tent filled with manufactured emergencies. Every ounce of energy I spent managing my mother and my sister was energy stolen from my own future. They did not want a relationship with me. They wanted a crisis manager with an open checkbook. I decided right then that I was permanently resigning from the position. The digital tantrum was only the first wave. The physical confrontation arrived the following Monday. I was working at my estate sale warehouse located in an industrial park in North Scottsdale. The building is a cavernous space filled with the remnants of other people's lives. Stacks of Persian rugs, rows of crystal chandeliers, and boxes of vintage silver flatware lined the concrete floor. The air smelled of old paper and lemon oil polish. I was categorizing a collection of antique pocket watches when the heavy metal side door creaked open. Beverly walked into the warehouse. She wore large sunglasses and a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, looking like a tragic heroine from an old film. She bypassed a set of Victorian dining chairs and marched straight toward my folding work table. She pulled off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red and puffy. She slammed her designer purse onto the table, rattling the delicate pocket watches. "Amelia," she gasped, pressing a hand against her collarbone, "you are embarrassing this family. Aunt Sarah is appalled. Harper has not stopped crying for 3 days. Her fiancé is questioning what kind of toxic family he is marrying into. You need to call the bank, reverse the dispute, and fix this right now." I set my jeweler's loop down on the table. I picked up a microfiber cloth and slowly polished the silver casing of a vintage watch. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic energy. "You committed wire fraud, Mom," I said. "You stole my financial security to buy flowers for a party. The bank fixed the crime. I am not reversing anything." Beverly flinched, stepping back as if I had struck her. "You are talking to your mother," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I raised you. I clothed you. I gave you everything. Families help each other. We do not throw around ugly words like fraud." It was a simple mistake. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk. Over the weekend, I had utilized my estate liquidator skills to conduct an audit of my own life. I pulled out a thick manila folder and dropped it onto the table next to her purse. "Open it," I instructed. Beverly stared at the folder, her hands trembling. She reached out and flipped the cover back. Inside was a spreadsheet printed on crisp white paper. It was an itemized invoice spanning 5 years. It detailed every electric bill I paid for her condo. It listed every car repair I funded. It chronicled the grocery runs, the medical copays, the property tax shortfalls, and the random cash transfers she requested to cover Harper's missed rent payments. The grand total at the bottom of the page was printed in bold black ink. It was a staggering number, a sum large enough to serve as a down payment on a second home. Beverly stared at the bold number. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen gray. "That is what it costs to be your daughter," I said. The words echoed in the quiet expanse of the warehouse. "That is the exact price of your peace. You claim I am selfish because I will not surrender my wedding vendor. You claim I hate my sister's happiness. The truth is, I have funded both of your lives for half a decade, while you treated me like an automated teller machine." Beverly opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The fabricated fragility vanished, replaced by the stark terror of a debtor facing a final notice. I leaned across the table. I tapped my index finger against the spreadsheet. "The Bank of Amelia is permanently closed," I stated. "I am not paying for your mistakes anymore. I am not funding Harper's lifestyle. You are both evicted from my bank account. If you ever attempt to access my finances or impersonate me to a vendor again, I will not call the bank. I will call the police." I closed the manila folder and pushed it toward her. "You can find the exit yourself." Beverly grabbed her purse and the folder. She turned and practically ran toward the heavy metal door, her heels clicking frantically against the concrete. The door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the quiet warehouse. I picked up the microfiber cloth and resumed polishing the silver watch. My hands were perfectly steady. I had set my first ironclad boundary. I severed the financial umbilical cord that kept them attached to me. But taking away a parasite's food source does not make the organism disappear. It just makes it hungry, angry, and desperate. I thought cutting off their access to my money would force them to leave me alone. I failed to realize that if Harper could not steal my vendor, and she could not steal my funds, she was going to target the one thing I valued most. The vintage Dior gown was scheduled for its final fitting, and my sister possessed a unique talent for destroying beautiful things. Exactly 4 weeks remained until I walked down the aisle. Downtown Phoenix radiates a dry, baking heat in September, but the interior of Madame Elena's tailoring studio felt like a refrigerated vault. Madame Elena was a master seamstress. She operated out of a second-story loft with exposed brick walls, towering windows, and heavy velvet privacy curtains. I stood on a circular wooden pedestal surrounded by floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I was wearing my grandmother's Dior gown, the silk draped perfectly over my ribs, feeling like cool water against my skin. The delicate lace sleeves rested flush against my wrists. For the first time in months, I felt beautiful. I felt insulated from the endless family negotiations and the financial extraction attempts. I breathed in the scent of pressed linen and lavender starch. Then the brass bell above the studio door chimed. Harper walked through the glass entryway. She carried an iced green matcha in one hand and wore oversized aviator sunglasses that hid half her face. Madame Elena paused her work, a mouthful of silver pins clamped firmly between her lips. I stared at my sister's reflection in the mirror. I had not spoken a single word to her since I dropped the financial audit on the warehouse table. I asked her how she knew I was here. Harper tapped her phone screen, offering a sugary, unbothered smile. She reminded me about the family location sharing application we installed 3 years ago when she took a road trip to California. It was a digital tether I had entirely forgotten about. She used it to track my movements across the city. The realization felt like a cold draft sweeping through the room. I stepped off the pedestal, walked to my leather purse, unlocked my screen, and permanently revoked her tracking access. I deleted the application. The digital cord snapped. Harper ignored the cold reception. She circled the pedestal like a predatory buyer evaluating a piece of distressed real estate. She did not offer a compliment. Her gaze locked onto the vintage fabric. The raw, unfiltered envy radiated from her posture, stiffening her shoulders and narrowing her eyes. She studied the way the ivory silk caught the studio lighting, assessing the monetary and social value of the garment. Madame Elena resumed her work. She knelt on the floor, adjusting a minor fold near the zipper with practiced precision. Harper took a sip of her iced drink. The ice rattled loudly in the plastic cup. She leaned toward the seamstress, gesturing vaguely at my feet. "You should really raise the front hem by at least 2 inches, Harper suggested. Her tone dripped with manufactured concern. Amelia has a very heavy step. She is going to trip over her own clumsy feet on that desert terrain. We do not want her ruining the photos with a fall." She framed the insult as helpful sisterly advice. It was a classic tactic. She attempted to recruit the professional in the room to validate her critique of my body. Madame Elena did not look up. The seamstress possessed the stoic professionalism of someone who had survived decades of high-stress bridal parties and demanding clients. She removed a single pin from her mouth. She stated that the hem was mathematically proportioned to the exact millimeter of my heel height. Altering the drape would ruin the architectural integrity of the skirt and disrupt the flow of the silk. Madame Elena effectively told my sister to sit down and remain quiet. Harper's jaw tightened. The rejection stung her ego. She retreated to a tufted velvet armchair in the corner of the loft, crossing her legs and resting her drink on her knee. She watched me in silence for the remainder of the session. Her eyes never left the dress. The fitting concluded 30 minutes later. Madame Elena carefully unzipped the structured bodice. I stepped out of the silk pool, leaving the gown resting safely in the seamstress's hands. I walked behind the heavy privacy curtains to change back into my street clothes. The studio fell quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioning unit and the rustle of my denim jeans. Then a sound pierced the silence. It was a sharp, distinct tearing noise. It was the unmistakable auditory signature of vintage thread separating under extreme tension. My stomach plummeted. I shoved the velvet curtain aside and rushed out into the main loft. Harper stood inches away from the hanging garment bag. Her right hand hovered near the delicate, tatted lace sleeve of the gown. She yanked her arm back the moment I stepped into view. She widened her eyes and brought her manicured fingers to her mouth in a display of exaggerated theatrical shock. "Oh, my God," Harper gasped. She pointed at the fabric. "My engagement ring just caught on the sleeve when I walked past to throw away my cup. It was a total accident. I am so sorry." I did not look at her face. I walked straight to the dress. A jagged 3-inch tear marred the intricate lace near the shoulder seam. The delicate vintage threads hung loose, unraveled, and frayed. An estate liquidator handles fragile antiques every day. You learn the physics of damage. You learn how materials react to stress. You do not accidentally snag a piece of fabric and cause a structural rupture of that magnitude without applying deliberate downward force. A passing ring creates a minor pull. A snag creates a run. But a 3-inch jagged rip requires a human hand grabbing the material and yanking hard. It was a deliberate sabotage. Madame Elena rushed over from her wooden cutting table. She inspected the torn lace. Her professional composure fractured into genuine, visceral horror. She touched the frayed edges with trembling fingertips. She looked at the torn sleeve. She looked at Harper, and then she looked at me. The seamstress understood exactly what just occurred in her sanctuary. She recognized an act of vandalism when she saw one. "I can fix this," Madame Elena whispered, her voice tight with anger on my behalf. "I can reweave the damaged section. I will work through the weekend to ensure the repair remains invisible to the naked eye. It will be perfect, Amelia. I promise you." I thanked the seamstress. I kept my voice steady, refusing to give Harper the satisfaction of a meltdown. I turned to look at my sister. Harper offered a pout, apologizing again, with a hollow, melodic tone that lacked a single ounce of genuine remorse. She picked up her empty plastic cup, offered a slight shrug, and walked out the glass door. She left me standing next to the damaged heirloom. I stood in the chilled loft, staring at the frayed threads of my grandmother's legacy. A cold realization settled deep into my bones, overriding the initial shock. The financial cutoff had not neutralized the threat. It only changed the battlefield. Harper no longer viewed the Dior gown as a dusty tragedy, nor did she view it merely with passive jealousy. Deprived of the engagement gala she wanted to steal, her obsession had mutated into active destruction. If she could not possess the spotlight, she was going to ensure I could not step into it either. She wanted me to walk down the aisle in a ruined dress, looking exactly like the clumsy, unworthy sister she always painted me to be. An estate liquidator knows that when a highly valuable asset becomes the target of a hostile party, you do not just lock the front door. You secure the asset itself. You build a fail-safe. You prepare for the worst possible human behavior. I watched Madame Elena carefully fold the damaged lace, preparing to begin the painstaking repair process. I realized I needed an insurance policy that my family could not see, could not predict, and could not break. The traditional rules of family engagement no longer applied. I needed a secret. I needed a trap. People often assume estate liquidation is simply the business of selling old furniture and organizing estate sales. They do not realize it is primarily the study of human greed. I have spent my entire career watching grieving families tear each other apart over a set of sterling silver flatware or a mid-century dining table. I have seen siblings change the locks on a childhood home before their mother's obituary even makes the Sunday paper. When a valuable asset is introduced into a fractured family dynamic, polite society drops its mask. People revert to their basest instincts. They take what they believe they are owed. My sister possessed that exact instinct. The torn lace in Madame Elena's tailoring studio was not an accident. It was a warning shot. Harper recognized she could no longer control my financial resources, so she pivoted her focus to my emotional breaking point. She wanted to ruin the vintage Dior gown to prove I could not have anything pristine. But a liquidator does not just witness human behavior. A liquidator anticipates it. We secure the perimeter. We catalog the valuables. We set up surveillance. I drove home from the tailor with a cold, mechanical focus. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight into my home office. I kept a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox bolted to the bottom shelf of my mahogany bookcase. I entered the numeric code. The heavy lid clicked open. Inside, resting beneath a stack of property deeds and birth certificates, was a single sheet of faded cream stationery. The letter belonged to our grandmother. She passed away when I was 19. She was a stoic, observant woman who homesteaded in the Arizona desert long before the luxury resorts paved over the red dirt. She preferred the quiet hum of the cicadas to the loud, performative drama my mother constantly generated. My grandmother saw our family structure with a brutal, unflinching clarity. She recognized Beverly's weakness. She identified Harper's vanity. She knew the toxic ecosystem was already taking root. Before she died, she wrote a blessing meant for the next woman in the bloodline to wear her wedding dress. She did not leave the name blank. She did not write a generic platitude about family unity. I unfolded the paper. The blue ink was thin but legible, penned in her sharp, angular cursive. To my dearest Amelia, the letter read, "Only you possess the quiet strength and the pure heart to carry the legacy of this family forward. The loud ones will always demand the spotlight, but the resilient ones build the foundation. Wear this dress with my blessing because you earned it. Protect your peace." She explicitly named me. It was not a shared heirloom open to interpretation or sibling negotiation. It was a targeted inheritance. My grandmother understood that someday Harper would try to claim the spotlight, and she provided the written documentation to stop her. I placed the delicate paper inside a heavy-duty, waterproof plastic sleeve, sealing the top edge to protect the faded ink from moisture and friction. I placed the sealed envelope into my purse. Then I drove to the nearest electronics store. I purchased a standard Apple AirTag. Sitting in the driver's seat of my car in the retail parking lot, I pulled the plastic tab to activate the tracking device. A soft electronic chime echoed in the quiet cabin. I opened the tracking application on my smartphone. The device synced immediately. A glowing blue dot appeared on my digital map, pinpointing my exact coordinates. I renamed the item in the application dashboard. I did not call it keys or wallet. I typed the word Dior. 2 days later, I returned to Madame Elena's studio in downtown Phoenix. The seamstress had worked a miracle. The jagged 3-inch tear in the tatted lace was gone, rewoven so meticulously that the damage was imperceptible to the naked eye. The gown hung from the ceiling hook looking pristine and untouchable. Madame Elena offered a relieved smile, expecting me to bag the garment and take it home. Instead, I placed the plastic sleeve and the electronic tracker onto her wooden cutting table. I presented a new, highly unconventional blueprint. I asked her to construct a hidden pocket deep inside the voluminous folds of the 1970s skirt. The gown featured layers of heavy silk and structured crinoline, providing ample architectural space to conceal a small modification. I requested a concealed zipper stitched flush against an interior seam near the bottom hemline, rendering it invisible unless a person knew exactly where to search. Madame Elena frowned, picking up the small white tracking disc. She looked at the waterproof sleeve. As a veteran of the bridal industry, she had witnessed demanding mothers and jealous bridesmaids, but she had never been asked to install surveillance equipment into a piece of vintage couture. I did not explain the depth of my sister's toxicity. I simply looked the seamstress in the eye and stated that my family had a history of misplacing valuable items, and I needed an insurance policy. Madame Elena thought about the torn lace from the previous visit. Her frown softened into a look of grim understanding. She nodded once, picked up her fabric shears, and went to work. I sat in the velvet armchair for an hour, listening to the rhythmic hum of the industrial sewing machine. When she finished, the seamstress called me over. She demonstrated the mechanism. Deep within the lining of the ivory skirt, disguised by an overlapping fold of silk, lay a tiny white zipper pull. She opened the pocket. I slid the waterproof sleeve containing my grandmother's handwritten blessing into the cavity. I dropped the activated tracking device in right behind it. I zipped the pocket shut. The weight was entirely negligible, perfectly balanced by the heavy drape of the vintage fabric. No outline showed through the exterior. The trap was locked. I paid Madame Elena a generous cash bonus for her discretion. I placed the gown inside a thick, opaque vinyl garment bag, securing the top with a reinforced knot. I dove back to my apartment as the desert sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. I walked through the front door and smelled roasted garlic and simmering tomatoes. Lucas was standing in the kitchen wearing his off-duty t-shirt, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. He smiled when I walked in, asking if the final repair looked okay. I hung the opaque garment bag on the designated hook in the hallway closet. I looked at Lucas. The urge to tell him the truth was a physical pressure in my chest. I wanted to show him the tracking dot on my phone. I wanted to tell him about the secret seam and the handwritten letter. He was my partner. We shared everything. But I kept my mouth shut. My silence was not born out of a lack of trust. It was a strategic necessity. Lucas possessed a fiercely protective nature. He spent his career pulling people out of danger. If I told him that Harper posed a credible, active threat to the wedding dress, his instincts would take over. He would confront Bryce. He would call my mother. He would demand they stay away from the venue. I did not want an intervention. An intervention would only delay the inevitable. If someone stops a thief at the door, the thief just waits for a better opportunity to strike. I needed Harper to walk through the door. I needed her to cross the line under her own power, driven by her own entitlement, so the consequences would be entirely her own. Isolating the variable meant keeping Lucas in the dark. I walked into the kitchen, wrapped my arms around his waist, and told him the dress was perfect. The trap was quietly, patiently set. It sat inside my closet, emitting a silent, digital pulse every few minutes, waiting for the trap spring to release. The weeks blurred into a frantic countdown. The desert temperatures began to drop, signaling the arrival of the autumn wedding season. The venue in Sedona was prepped. The new florist confirmed the delivery schedule. The vendors memorized the verbal security password. We packed our vehicles and drove north toward the Red Rocks, entering the final phase of the timeline. The rehearsal dinner loomed ahead. I knew my mother and my sister would attend. The air felt thick, heavy with the atmospheric pressure that precedes a violent desert monsoon. I had secured my finances, I had secured my vendors, and I had secured the asset. The only remaining question was how far my sister was willing to escalate her campaign to steal the show. The drive north from Phoenix to Sedona takes about 2 hours. The landscape shifts from sprawling urban grids and saguaro cacti to towering iron-rich monoliths. The red rocks of Sedona possess a raw, ancient energy. They look like jagged teeth cutting into the bright Arizona sky. We booked a secluded boutique resort nestled deep within a canyon, far removed from the tourist traffic of the main highway. The property featured low-slung adobe architecture, meandering crushed gravel pathways, and native juniper trees. It was designed for privacy. It was designed for peace. Friday afternoon arrived in a blur of logistical coordination. I directed the caterers to the outdoor kitchen. I reviewed the lighting schematic with the rental company. The new floral designer arrived in an unmarked van, discreetly unloading massive arrangements of dried cholla wood and white protea. She whispered the security password, vintage, before handing me the delivery manifest. The perimeter remained secure. No unauthorized changes were attempted. The sun began to dip behind the canyon walls, casting long, bruised shadows across the resort grounds. The temperature dropped rapidly, replacing the daytime heat with a crisp, high-altitude chill. The wedding party gathered on an outdoor terrace for the rehearsal dinner. String lights illuminated the space. The catering staff circulated with trays of seared tenderloin and roasted root vegetables. The atmosphere was convivial and warm. Friends from college mingled with Lucas's paramedic crew. Laughter echoed against the adobe walls. Then Harper made her entrance. She did not arrive quietly. She walked onto the terrace accompanied by the sharp, rhythmic click of designer stiletto heels against the flagstone patio. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A low murmur rippled through the gathered guests. Harper was wearing a floor-length white silk dress. It was not an off-white cocktail dress. It was not a subtle cream sundress. It was a formal, structured evening gown crafted from bright, optic white silk. The garment featured a plunging neckline, a dramatic thigh-high slit, and a trailing hem that swept across the stone pavers. She had spent hours in a salon. Her hair cascaded in perfect, voluminous waves. Her makeup was meticulously applied for high-definition photography. She looked stunning. She also looked exactly like a bride. She walked toward the center of the terrace, holding Bryce's arm. Bryce looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting toward the floor, clearly aware of the social transgression occurring, but lacking the spine to stop it. Harper, however, beamed. She greeted my friends with an overly bright, performative cheerfulness. She posed for photos, ensuring the white silk caught the ambient light from the overhead bulbs. It was a blatant, unapologetic attempt to upstage the bride on the eve of the wedding. It was a territorial display. I stood near the outdoor fireplace holding a glass of sparkling water. I did not flinch. I did not drop my glass. An estate liquidator understands the mechanics of desperate bidding. When a buyer realizes they cannot afford the premier item at an auction, they often attempt to hijack the room by loudly showing off a counterfeit piece. They want an audience. They want a reaction. My mother materialized at my elbow. Beverly had spent the evening hovering near the perimeter, clutching a glass of wine, assessing the crowd. She wore a subdued navy pantsuit, trying to project the image of a dignified matriarch. She leaned in close, bringing the scent of heavy floral perfume and nervous sweat into my personal space. Amelia Beverly whispered, her voice a frantic, breathless hiss. Just ignore her outfit. Do not cause a scene tonight. Bryce's parents are sitting right over there. Harper is feeling terribly insecure because Bryce has been distant lately. She just needs to feel beautiful tonight. Please be the bigger person. Let her have this. I looked at my mother. The sheer absurdity of her demand hung in the crisp evening air. She was asking the bride to ignore the maid of honor wearing a white evening gown to the rehearsal dinner, framing the sociopathic wardrobe choice as a symptom of low self-esteem that I was required to accommodate. I took a slow sip of my water. "You are assuming I care what she is wearing, Mom," I said. My voice was calm-pitched just low enough that she had to strain to hear it. "She does not look beautiful. She looks like a woman who is terrified no one is paying attention to her. Let her wear white. Let everyone in this room see exactly how desperate she is." Beverly recoiled. The blunt assessment pierced her manufactured narrative. She opened her mouth to argue, but the clinking of a silver fork against crystal echoed across the terrace. Lucas stood at the head table. He had removed his suit jacket, rolling the sleeves of his crisp white shirt up to his forearms. He held a champagne flute in his right hand. The low hum of conversation faded into expectant silence. the string lights reflected in his eyes. "I want to thank everyone for driving up the mountain to be with us tonight," Lucas began. His voice projected effortlessly, carrying the steady, commanding cadence he utilized on chaotic accident scenes. "We are surrounded by incredible friends and a solid crew. But I primarily want to raise a glass to my future wife." He turned his gaze toward me. The warmth in his expression anchored me to the flagstone patio. "Amelia is the strongest person I have ever met," Lucas continued. He did not look at his notes. He spoke from the chest. "She has spent her entire life managing chaos. She is the person people call when everything falls apart. And she is the person who quietly sweeps up the broken glass. For years, she has been the anchor in the storm for people who never bothered to learn how to swim." The silence on the terrace deepened. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Lucas slowly pivoted his stance. He let his gaze drift across the crowd, purposefully locking eyes with Harper, who was standing near the bar in her optic white silk. Then his gaze shifted to Beverly, who was gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were white. "But storms eventually pass," Lucas said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a hard, unyielding edge. "And an anchor eventually needs to be pulled up if the ship is ever going to move forward. Amelia, tomorrow you stop carrying the weight of the past. You step into the future." To the woman who finally learned how to let go. He raised his glass. The paramedic crew erupted into loud, genuine cheers. My friends clapped enthusiastically. Harper's face froze in a rigid, brittle mask. Beverly looked at the ground. Lucas had just delivered a surgical, public indictment of their behavior without using a single profanity. He did not need to scream. He simply held up a mirror to the room, forcing them to look at their own reflection. The toast broke the tension, shifting the energy from awkward avoidance to a palpable, electric anticipation for the wedding day. The dinner concluded an hour later. The guests dispersed, retreating to their respective cabins across the resort property. I said goodnight to Lucas near the main lobby. Tradition dictated we spend the night before the ceremony in separate rooms. He kissed my forehead, telling me to get some rest, and promised to see me at the end of the aisle. I walked along the crushed gravel pathway toward my private bridal suite. The night air was silent, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the distant call of a canyon owl. I unlocked the heavy wooden door of my cabin. The interior was spacious, featuring exposed wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a massive king-sized bed. I bypassed the bathroom and walked straight toward the master closet. I opened the slatted wooden doors. The heavy, opaque vinyl garment bag hung exactly where I had left it. I reached out and touched the thick material. I checked the industrial zipper. It was pulled tight, secured at the top collar. The reinforced plastic hook rested firmly on the wooden closet rod. The vintage Dior gown was safe. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened the tracking application. The glowing blue dot rested directly on top of my geographical location. The secret seam remained undisturbed. I closed the closet doors. I walked to the main entryway of the cabin. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt, hearing the solid metal cylinder slide into place. I engaged the secondary chain lock. I walked to the windows, pulling the heavy blackout curtains shut, plunging the suite into total darkness. I set my phone alarm for 5:30 in the morning. I crawled into the massive bed, pulling the thick duvet over my shoulders. I was physically exhausted. The emotional toll of the rehearsal dinner, the logistical marathon of the week, and the lingering adrenaline from Lucas's toast weighed heavily on my limbs. But my mind was remarkably clear. The perimeter was locked, the asset was secured, the trap was armed. I closed my eyes, drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep, ready for tomorrow. I woke up expecting the quiet routine of hair, makeup, and nervous excitement. I did not know that while I slept, the final boundary was about to be breached, and the digital dot on my phone was going to start moving. 6:30 in the morning arrived with a soft digital chime from my alarm clock. The Arizona sun began its slow ascent over the canyon, painting the jagged sandstone monoliths in brilliant shades of copper and rusted gold. I pushed the heavy duvet aside. The slate floor felt cold against my bare feet, grounding me in the reality of the day. I walked to the kitchenette, filling the glass carafe with filtered water, measuring out dark roast coffee grounds. The machine sputtered to life, filling the suite with a rich, roasted aroma. It was my wedding morning. The atmosphere felt thick with anticipation, carrying the quiet stillness that precedes a monumental life shift. I carried a steaming ceramic mug toward the bedroom, my mind running through the logistical timeline. Hair and makeup artists were scheduled to arrive at 8 o'clock. The photographer requested access to the apparel and the rings by 9 to capture detail shots. I took a sip of the hot liquid, letting the warmth settle into my chest. I walked toward the master closet, reaching out to grasp the wooden slatted doors. I pulled them apart. The overhead bulb flickered on. I looked at the opaque vinyl garment bag. Something was wrong. The industrial zipper, which I had securely fastened to the top collar the previous night, now rested near the bottom hem. The protective casing hung wide open, exposing the dark interior cavity. My lungs seized. I dropped my ceramic mug. It shattered against the slate floor, sending hot coffee splashing across my ankles. I did not feel the burn. I reached out and grabbed the vinyl material, pulling it completely apart. The velvet hanger swung back and forth, offering a silent, mocking pendulum rhythm. It was empty. The vintage Christian Dior heirloom, the legacy piece I spent $3,400 restoring, the tailored silk meant for my walk down the aisle, was gone. Panic is a primal biological response. It floods the bloodstream with cortisol, urging the human body to scream, cry, or run. For 10 agonizing seconds, the walls of the Adobe suite seemed to compress inward. My vision tunneled. I stared at the swinging velvet hanger, trying to process the sheer impossibility of vanishing couture. Then the panic receded, replaced by the cold, analytical framework of my profession. An estate liquidator does not succumb to hysteria when a highly valuable asset goes missing. They investigate the chain of custody. They secure the crime scene. I turned around and inspected the main entryway. The brass deadbolt remained engaged. The secondary chain lock dangled freely against the doorframe. There were no scratches on the metal cylinder, no splintered wood, no signs of a forced breach. No intruder broke the lock. The thief utilized a magnetic keycard. My mind flipped backward, reviewing the events from yesterday afternoon. When Lucas and I checked into the resort, the matriarch of my family hovered near the reception desk. Beverly had claimed her blood sugar was prone to crashing in the high altitude of the mountains. She requested a duplicate keycard for my bridal suite, citing a nurturing desire to drop off a tray of fresh fruit and pastries before I woke up. I had authorized the front desk staff to issue the duplicate, assuming her performative fussing was harmless. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. I had fortified the perimeter against a hostile breach, but I had handed the Trojan horse the keys to the gate. She waited until the dead of night, bypassed the sleeping bride, and extracted the target. I stepped carefully over the shattered ceramic shards, walking to the nightstand. I picked up my smartphone. My fingers lacked their usual dexterity, trembling slightly as I unlocked the digital screen. I opened the tracking application. The interface loaded, displaying a topographical map of the Sedona region. I searched for the designated hardware, labeled Dior. A glowing blue dot materialized on the grid. It was not hovering over my cabin. It was not on the resort property. The signal pulsed exactly 2 miles south. It was moving at approximately 45 miles per hour down the main scenic byway. I zoomed in on the trajectory. The blue dot navigated a sweeping curve along the canyon road and stopped. It anchored itself at the precise geographic coordinates of the historic sanctuary we had rented for the morning ceremony. As I stared at the location data, my screen shifted. The tracking map disappeared, replaced by an incoming call notification. A photograph of Beverly illuminated the display. I pressed the green acceptance icon and raised the device to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. "Amelia, honey, good morning," she chirped. Her voice sounded bright, breathless, and laced with an artificial sugary sweetness that immediately signaled a monumental deception. She spoke with the frantic cadence of a guilty suspect trying to outrun an accusation. We have a tiny, insignificant emergency over here, but everything is totally fine now, the older woman continued. Harper had a little wardrobe malfunction this morning. That white evening gown she wore last night to the rehearsal, she wanted to wear it today as her maid of honor outfit, but the side zipper completely blew out when she was getting dressed. It is ruined. She paused, waiting for me to react. I maintained absolute silence, letting her fill the void with her own audacity. We were in a massive rush, she explained, her tempo accelerating. We had to borrow your apparel. We slipped into your room while you were sleeping so we would not wake you. Harper is just going to wear the vintage piece for a quick professional photo session at the church before the guests arrive. Do not be mad. Bryce's parents hired an exclusive magazine photographer to capture some early portraits, and your sibling needed something spectacular to wear for the publication. The psychological warfare was breathtaking. She orchestrated a premeditated theft, framed it as an unavoidable emergency, and downgraded a generational heirloom to a casual loan. But she was not finished dictating the terms of my humiliation. You have that beautiful backup silk slip we bought during the summer, right? Beverly asked. Wear that. It is a desert aesthetic. It will look so chic and minimalist. We will see you at the altar in a few hours. The line clicked dead. She disconnected the call before I could utter a single syllable. I lowered the phone from my ear. Harper was currently standing in my rented sanctuary, wearing my grandmother's legacy, posing for cameras. They believed I would accept the degradation to preserve the public illusion of family harmony. They assumed the quiet daughter would simply swallow the indignity, put on a glorified nightgown, and surrender her own spotlight to avoid creating a scene. They relied on my lifetime habit of absorbing their collateral damage. I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. The woman staring back at me was done acting as a human shield. The era of keeping the peace was officially over. I did not walk to my luggage to retrieve the backup slip. I walked to the armchair. I picked up my faded blue denim jeans, a crisp white button-down shirt, and my scuffed leather work boots. I began to dress for a demolition. I secured the laces on my work boots, pulling the leather tight across my ankles. I tucked the crisp white button-down shirt into my faded blue jeans. I did not apply mascara. I did not curl my hair. I looked like an estate liquidator preparing to break down a hoarded property, which felt entirely appropriate given the situation. I grabbed my car keys, stepped over the shattered ceramic coffee mug, and walked out of the bridal suite. The crisp mountain air hit my face as I navigated the crushed gravel pathway toward the main lobby of the resort. A few early rising guests were sipping espresso on the patio. They offered polite, confused smiles, clearly recognizing I was the bride, but unable to process my wardrobe choice on the morning of the ceremony. I ignored them. I kept my eyes focused on the heavy wooden doors of the reception building. Lucas stood near the valet stand. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, a silver tie, and polished Oxfords. He held 2 cups of black coffee in a cardboard carrier. He turned his head as the heavy doors swung open. He saw my faded denim. He saw my heavy leather boots. He saw the cold, unyielding tension locked into my jawline. He did not ask where the vintage Dior silk was. He did not ask why I looked ready to pour concrete instead of walk down an aisle. He possessed the rare emotional intelligence to read a crisis without requiring a verbal briefing. He handed me a cup of coffee. I have the truck running, Lucas said. His voice lacked any trace of panic or judgment. We play this exactly your way. Let's go. We walked to his heavy-duty pickup truck idling near the entrance. I climbed into the passenger seat. The massive engine roared as he shifted into gear, accelerating down the scenic byway. The 2-mile drive felt like navigating a wind tunnel. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt. We passed the jagged red rock formations descending toward the historic sanctuary nestled in the valley floor. Lucas pulled the truck into the chapel parking lot. He threw the transmission into park and killed the engine. He looked at me across the center console. "You point, I shoot," he told me. I nodded once. I opened the door and stepped out onto the pavement. The sanctuary was a beautiful Spanish colonial structure built from adobe clay and heavy timber beams. The massive arched wooden doors stood propped open to allow the morning light to flood the interior. I walked toward the entrance, my leather boots striking the stone steps with a heavy, deliberate cadence. I crossed the threshold into the vestibule. The interior of the church buzzed with pre-event activity. The new floral designer was arranging massive displays of white protea and ghost succulents along the pews. The string quartet sat in the choir loft, tuning their violins. A low hum of ambient noise filled the vaulted ceiling. Then I looked toward the front of the room. My sister stood at the altar. Harper was wearing my wedding dress. The 1970s ivory silk draped over her hips, the pearlescent fabric glowing beneath the stained glass windows. The hand-tatted lace sleeves hugged her wrists. She looked radiant, ethereal, and entirely comfortable inside the stolen garment. She posed with her chin tilted upward, laughing a bright melodic laugh as a professional photographer circled her, snapping rapid-fire shots. Bryce stood next to her in a tailored tuxedo, looking slightly bewildered but compliant, acting as a prop for her vanity. Beverly paced near the communion rail. She was aggressively directing the photo shoot. She waved her arms, instructing the photographer to capture Harper from a lower angle to emphasize the architectural drape of the vintage skirt. "Move to the left," Beverly shouted over the classical tuning notes. "Make sure you get the cathedral train in the frame. This is the cover shot for the bridal magazine submission." Bryce looked at her like she is the only woman in the world. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. It bypassed normal sibling rivalry and crossed into a realm of pure, unadulterated pathology. They had broken into my suite, stolen my inheritance, and commandeered my venue to stage a counterfeit wedding photo shoot hours before my actual ceremony began. They did this without a shred of guilt, confident in their assumption that I would submit to the humiliation to avoid creating a public scandal. I stepped out of the shadows of the vestibule and walked into the center aisle. My work boots echoed against the historic flagstone floor. The heavy, rhythmic thud cut through the ambient noise. The lead violinist lowered his bow. The florist paused mid-step, holding a bundle of desert sage. The photographer stopped clicking. The manufactured joy at the altar evaporated. Harper turned her head. She saw me standing in the middle of the sanctuary. Her bright laugh died in her throat. Her eyes darted from my faded denim to the cold, dead stare I aimed directly at her face. Bryce took a step backward, physically creating distance between himself and my sister. He finally grasped the severity of the situation. He looked at the vintage gown, looked at my jeans, and the blood drained from his face. I did not scream. I did not rush the altar. I simply stood my ground, occupying the space I paid for, watching the perpetrators realize they were caught in the act. The atmosphere inside the chapel turned brittle, charged with an electric tension that threatened to shatter the stained glass. Beverly spun around. She locked eyes with me. The older woman recognized the lethal calm radiating from my posture. She knew I was not there to play the compliant victim. But a narcissist caught in a lie rarely surrenders. Instead of apologizing, they double down on the deception. They attempt to manipulate the narrative, turning their own crime into an act of tragic necessity. My mother squared her shoulders, plastered a frantic smile across her face, and prepared to deliver the ultimate gaslighting performance. Beverly recognized the danger, standing in the center aisle. She abandoned her post near the communion rail and rushed toward me. Her beige pumps clicked frantically against the stone pavers. She closed the distance in seconds, throwing her arms out wide to create a physical barricade between my boots and the altar. She grabbed my forearms. Her grip felt tight and clammy. She leaned in close, bringing the cloying scent of her signature floral perfume into my personal space. Her eyes darted around the sanctuary, checking to see who was watching the confrontation. "Do not make a scene right now," Beverly whispered. Her voice carried a frantic, sharp edge, pitched low to avoid echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We have a terrible situation on our hands." The track got stuck when she put it on this morning. The metal teeth jammed against the lining. If we force it off her body, the vintage silk will tear to shreds. "She cannot take it off, Amelia. The fabric will be ruined." I stared down at the woman holding my arms. I knew exactly how the garment was constructed. Madame Elena had replaced the original closure with a heavy-duty industrial zipper. It was engineered to withstand significant tension. It did not simply jam on its own. My mother was lying to my face, using the preservation of the heirloom as a hostage negotiation tactic. She was weaponizing my respect for the dress to force my compliance. This exact scenario had played out 100 times before, just on a smaller scale. When I was 17 years old, I won a regional academic scholarship. The organizers hosted an awards banquet to present a commemorative plaque. Harper threw a spectacular tantrum in our kitchen that afternoon, weeping because she felt invisible and unaccomplished. Beverly ordered me to invite Harper onto the auditorium stage to accept the plaque with me as a joint achievement. She demanded I share the applause to protect my sister from feeling inadequate. The golden child received the glory, while the scapegoat surrendered the reward. Standing in the historic chapel 15 years later, I realized the underlying disease had never been cured. It had only grown more malignant. Beverly tightened her grip on my forearms. She delivered the final, unhinged proposal. "Just let her walk down the aisle first," my mother pleaded. "Think of it as a beautiful tribute to your grandmother. She can lead the procession, then you can walk down the aisle right behind her in your backup slip. It will show everyone how united our family is. Be the bigger person today. Do not ruin her moment. Bryce and his wealthy parents are watching us right now." The sheer audacity of the demand defied logical comprehension. My mother was asking the bride to step aside at her own wedding so the maid of honor could parade down the aisle wearing the stolen bridal gown. She framed this grotesque humiliation as a noble tribute to a dead relative. She leveraged the presence of Bryce and his affluent family as social pressure, implying that my refusal would humiliate them in front of high society. She expected me to march toward my groom wearing a glorified nightgown, trailing behind my radiant, thieving sibling like a forgotten afterthought. I looked past my mother's shoulder. Harper stood 20 feet away, illuminated by the morning sun filtering through the stained glass windows. She held the bouquet of desert wildflowers loosely in her right hand. She turned her head slightly, catching my gaze. She offered a faux apologetic smile. She dipped her chin, attempting to look demure and helpless. Then the corners of her mouth twitched upward. The expression settled into a distinct, victorious smirk. She ran her manicured fingers over the delicate, tatted lace on her wrist, a deliberate, territorial gesture. The silent communication radiating from the altar was unmistakable. Harper was delivering a final verdict. She took the floral vendor I spent 6 months securing. She commanded the attention of the room. She stole the vintage couture tailored for my body. And our mother was acting as her personal shield, actively protecting the theft while condemning the victim. The message was clear. You lose, Amelia. You will always lose, because I am the priority and you are the collateral damage. The tension in the sanctuary became a tangible weight. The photographer lowered his camera, stepping back into the shadows of the choir loft, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in his lens. Bryce stood paralyzed near the baptismal font. His face remained pale, his posture rigid. He looked at Harper, then at my faded denim jeans, slowly processing the toxic reality of the woman he intended to marry. The florist busied herself with a bucket of white protea, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. The social pressure of the room was a heavy blanket designed by Beverly to crush my resistance and force my quiet submission. I did not pull my arms out of my mother's grip. I stood perfectly still. The adrenaline in my bloodstream began to recede, replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused clarity. An estate liquidator knows when a negotiation is dead. You cannot reason with a person who fundamentally believes your property belongs to them. You cannot appeal to the conscience of a parent who views your dignity as an acceptable sacrifice for another child's comfort. Beverly expected me to argue. Harper expected me to cry. They both expected me to eventually fold under the crushing weight of public expectation and family loyalty. I felt Lucas step up behind me. He did not say a word. He did not place a hand on my shoulder. His silent presence was a solid, grounding force at my back. He was the only person in the room who knew I was not preparing to surrender. I looked at the ivory silk draped over my sister's hips. I looked at the desperate, frantic eyes of the woman who raised me. The urge to detonate the room swelled inside my chest. The urge to scream, to tear the fabric, to burn the entire illusion to the ground was a potent, intoxicating poison. I had the power to turn the historic chapel into a spectacular war zone. My breathing slowed to a deliberate, measured rhythm. I cataloged the sensory details of the ultimate betrayal. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of colored light, the faint smell of beeswax polish and old wood, the cold stone beneath my heavy leather boots. Every element of the sanctuary burned itself into my memory. This was the exact moment the familial bond severed permanently. There was no going back to polite holiday dinners. There were no future compromises. The bridge was not just burned, it was pulverized. Harper stood at the altar waiting for my reaction. She wanted the spectacle. She thrived on the chaos. Giving her a screaming match would feed her victim complex for the next decade. She would spin the story to anyone who would listen, claiming the jealous bride ruined the sacred morning with a volatile outburst. I realized the most destructive thing I could do was deny her the explosion she craved. The loud weapon was a trap. I needed a different strategy. I needed to execute a surgical strike that left no room for debate and no room for her fabricated victimhood. The center aisle of the historic chapel felt 1,000 miles long. The ambient noise in the room vanished, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Beverly still gripped my forearms, her fingernails digging into my skin. Harper remained anchored at the altar, cloaked in ivory silk, wearing her victorious smirk like a crown. A potent, acidic rage flooded my system. The urge to deploy the loud weapon was an intoxicating siren song. I stood paralyzed on the flagstone floor, mapping out the destruction in my mind. The fantasy of explosive vengeance played out behind my eyes with terrifying clarity. I imagined breaking free from my mother's grasp. I pictured myself marching up the remaining distance to the altar. My heavy work boots would strike the stone with a deafening rhythm. I would not stop to negotiate. I would reach out with both hands and grab the delicate hand-tatted lace adorning the bodice of the Dior gown. I imagined the brutal satisfaction of planting my feet, clenching my fists, and ripping the vintage fabric right down the middle. The sound of tearing silk would echo off the vaulted ceiling. I envisioned the chaos erupting in the sanctuary. Harper would scream, scrambling backward to cover herself. Beverly would collapse against the communion rail in hysterics. I would pivot toward Bryce and his gathered family members, raising my voice until it cracked. I would scream the entire inventory of my sister's crimes. I would expose the unpaid utility bills, the fraudulent florist, deposit the stolen heirloom. I would force them to see the exact nature of the parasite they were welcoming into their affluent lineage. The photographer would undoubtedly capture the brawl. Someone would pull out a smartphone and record the meltdown. The viral chaos would spread across social media within hours. The police would inevitably be dispatched to separate us. The entire wedding day would burn to the ground in a spectacular, unforgettable conflagration. It would be completely justified. The theft warranted a catastrophic response. The absolute destruction of the morning felt like the only appropriate currency to pay for their audacity. But as the adrenaline spiked, sharpening my vision, I caught sight of Lucas standing near the vestibule doors. He remained perfectly still, a calm silhouette against the bright morning light pouring into the chapel. He was not stepping forward to hold me back. He was not gesturing for me to retreat. He was simply holding space, watching me navigate the precipice. His quiet strength grounded me. Looking at him, a memory surfaced from deep within the archives of my professional life. 2 years ago, I handled the liquidation of a massive commercial bakery. The owner had spent a decade propping up his younger brother's gambling debts, draining the business accounts to cover the losses. The brother eventually embezzled the final payroll check and skipped town. I found the owner sitting on the floor of his industrial walk-in freezer, staring at a stack of unpaid invoices. He looked up at me with hollow, exhausted eyes. He delivered a profound observation. He told me that you cannot punish a leech by screaming at it. The leech lacks the capacity to feel shame. It only understands consumption. Yelling at a parasite simply alerts the organism that it successfully elicited a reaction. To eliminate the threat, you do not engage in a loud, messy brawl. You simply detach the creature from the vein and let it starve. The bakery owner's wisdom hit me with the force of a physical blow. The fantasy of ripping the dress and screaming at the altar evaporated. If I chose the loud weapon, I would surrender control of the narrative. A screaming, violent bride creates a chaotic spectacle. The core issue, the theft of the heirloom, would be buried beneath the sheer volume of my reaction. Harper would instantly transform from a calculating thief into a traumatized victim who survived an unhinged assault by her jealous sibling. Beverly would spin the story for the next 20 years, telling the extended family how my mental breakdown ruined a sacred day. Bryce's family would view me as a volatile, unstable woman. I would look crazy. I would confirm every false narrative my sister ever constructed about me. To win this war, I needed to remove the emotion entirely. I needed to execute a surgical strike. A liquidator does not win an argument by throwing a tantrum over a stolen painting. We win by producing the binding contract and the irrefutable receipt of ownership. I required an undeniable public revelation that Harper could not spin, cry, or scream her way out of. I needed an authority figure to drop the guillotine. I slowly turned my head, scanning the perimeter of the sanctuary. Past the floral arrangements, past the tuning string quartet, my eyes locked onto a figure standing near the wooden steps of the choir loft. Pastor Dave stood with his arms crossed over his chest. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, a native of the Arizona desert who possessed the rugged, weathered countenance of someone who spent his youth working ranches. He had served the local congregation for over 3 decades. He had presided over my grandmother's funeral. He knew the complex, difficult history of the Alexander family. He knew Beverly's propensity for dramatic martyrdom. Most importantly, he knew I was the one who quietly paid the property taxes on the family home for 5 years so my mother would not face foreclosure. He knew who built the foundation, and he knew who danced on the roof. Pastor Dave wore his clerical collar and a dark suit. He was observing the tableau unfolding at the altar with a hard, unreadable expression. He saw Harper parading in the vintage gown. He saw my faded denim. He witnessed Beverly physically blocking my path in the center aisle. He recognized a hostage situation when it played out in his own sanctuary. My breathing leveled out. My heart rate dropped to a steady, rhythmic pulse. The intoxicating lure of the loud weapon faded, replaced by the lethal, mechanical focus of my profession. The trap I constructed inside the tailoring studio in Phoenix was armed and ready to trigger. The digital tracker in my pocket confirmed the asset was present. The handwritten blessing was sealed inside the hem. I looked down at Beverly. Her manicured fingers were still digging into my arms. Her eyes were wide, desperate, waiting for my capitulation. I did not shove her. I did not yell. I simply rotated my wrists, breaking her grip with a sharp downward motion. I stepped to the left, smoothly bypassing her physical barricade. I did not march toward Harper. I ignored the altar entirely. I adjusted the collar of my crisp, white button-down shirt. I walked with measured, deliberate strides toward the shadows of the choir loft, keeping my eyes locked on the clergyman. I was preparing to hand the detonator to a man who commanded the respect of every single person in the room. The flagstone pavers felt solid beneath my boots as I changed my trajectory. I did not look at the altar. I did not acknowledge the bright flashes of the photographer's camera or the rustle of the heavy silk skirt as Harper adjusted her pose. I treated them like irrelevant pieces of furniture in a room slated for demolition. I walked past the bewildered florist and approached the steps leading toward the choir loft. Pastor Dave stood near the carved wooden railing. His silver hair caught the morning light filtering down from the clerestory windows. He was a man who appreciated order, truth, and direct communication. When he delivered a sermon, he did not rely on theological jargon. He spoke in plain, unvarnished terms that resonated with the blue-collar community of the valley. He watched me approach, his weathered face settling into a grim line. He did not offer a greeting. He simply waited for the briefing. I stopped 2 feet away from him. I did not whisper, but I kept my voice pitched low enough that the sound would not travel past the front row of pews. The acoustics in the chapel were designed to amplify sound, so I spoke in a flat, controlled monotone. "Pastor," I began, keeping my gaze locked on his face. "My mother used a duplicate keycard to enter my suite while I was sleeping last night. She stole my grandmother's wedding dress so my sister could wear it this morning." Pastor Dave's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked toward the altar, taking in the visual confirmation of the crime, and then snapped back to me. He did not express disbelief. He knew Beverly's history. He knew the lengths she would travel to coddle her youngest daughter. A muscle feathered along the edge of his jawline. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans. I retrieved my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and opened the tracking application. The digital map illuminated, showing the glowing blue dot anchored precisely at our current GPS coordinates. I tilted the screen toward the clergyman. "I anticipated a hostile extraction," I explained calmly. "I paid a seamstress to build a concealed cavity deep inside the interior lining of the skirt. I planted an electronic tracking beacon inside the hem. Alongside the beacon, I sealed a handwritten letter from my grandmother. The letter explicitly bequeaths the garment to me. It is a targeted inheritance." The pastor studied the glowing screen. The technological surveillance confirmed the premeditated nature of my defense. He looked at the flat, deadened expression in my eyes. He understood the severity of the boundary breach. The theft escalated from a minor family squabble into a deliberate act of emotional sabotage committed inside his sanctuary. The confusion melted from his features, rapidly calcifying into a cold, righteous anger. "What do you require, Amelia?" he asked. His voice resembled gravel grinding against steel. "I need an impartial authority to establish the chain of custody," I replied. "If I confront them, they will scream. They will claim the dress is a shared heirloom. They will label me a hysterical bride ruining the morning. I need you to execute the search warrant." Pastor Dave nodded once. It was a sharp, definitive motion. He did not require further instruction. He buttoned his dark suit jacket, squared his broad shoulders, and turned his back on me. He walked with purpose. The heavy, measured thud of his dress shoes echoed through the chapel, matching the cadence of my own arrival minutes earlier. He bypassed the empty wooden pews, striding directly down the center aisle. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The ambient tension mutated into palpable alarm. An authority figure moving with lethal intent commands attention. The photographer sensed the shifting dynamic. He lowered his expensive camera, stepping backward until his shoulder bumped against the carved wooden pulpit. Bryce took another step toward the side exit, his eyes widening as the tall clergyman approached the altar. Pastor Dave ascended the 2 steps leading to the chancel. He did not hesitate. He walked straight toward Harper, stepping directly into the center of the photographer's designated staging area. He positioned his large frame between my sister and the camera lens, physically blocking the photo shoot. Harper blinked, startled by the intrusion. Her victorious smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but Pastor Dave raised his right hand. It was a silent, commanding gesture that demanded immediate compliance. He turned his head toward the choir loft. He locked eyes with the lead violinist. "Stop playing," the pastor ordered. The command cracked through the air like a whip. The musician yanked his bow off the strings. The remaining 3 players immediately ceased their tuning. The sudden cessation of music created a vacuum. The silence in the vaulted chapel was absolute, heavy, and deafening. The absence of sound amplified the gravity of the moment. The air felt thin, stripped of oxygen. Beverly scrambled up the steps to the altar. Her beige pumps slipped slightly on the polished wood. She inserted herself into the standoff, her hands fluttering nervously around her throat. The manufactured panic returned to her features. "Oh, Pastor Dave," she stammered, her voice breathless and artificially bright. "Good morning. We are just running slightly ahead of schedule. We were just doing some quick pre-wedding shots for the bridal magazine submission, a little tribute to the family history before the guests arrive. Amelia is getting changed right now." Pastor Dave did not look at my mother. He kept his gaze fixed entirely on the woman wearing the vintage silk. He raised his hand again, extending a single index finger toward Beverly's face, silencing her mid-sentence. The matriarch snapped her mouth shut. The abrupt dismissal shocked her into submission. The script had flipped. Harper realized the power dynamic was spiraling out of her control. She shifted her weight, the heavy fabric rustling loudly in the quiet room. She looked toward Bryce for support, but her fiancé was staring at the floorboards. She looked toward her mother, but Beverly was immobilized by the pastor's silent rebuke. Harper was entirely isolated on the altar. The protective shield of family enabling shattered against the cold reality of an impartial judge. The narcissistic illusion she relied upon to justify the theft evaporated. She was not a radiant maid of honor honoring a family legacy. She was a woman caught wearing stolen property, standing before a man who possessed the moral authority to publicly dismantle her lie. I remained standing near the choir loft, leaning my shoulder against the wooden railing. I crossed my arms over my chest. I did not gloat. I simply watched the architect of my misery realize she was trapped in a room with no exits. The trap spring released, and the metal teeth were about to close around her ankle. The surgical strike had commenced, and I did not have to raise my voice a single decibel to watch her world burn. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the sanctuary creaked open, breaking the stifling silence. Footsteps echoed in the vestibule. Bryce's parents, an affluent couple who summered in Paradise Valley and wintered in Aspen, stepped into the chapel. They arrived early to secure front-row seating, expecting a serene morning of classical music and polite society mingling. Instead, they walked into a frozen tableau of familial hostility. They stopped near the baptismal font, their expression shifting from polite anticipation to guarded confusion. They stared at the altar. They looked at their son, who stood rigid and pale. They looked at the bride in denim, standing near the choir loft. Then they looked at my sister, wearing vintage couture that clearly did not belong to her. Harper noticed the new arrivals. The social currency she valued above all else was suddenly in the room, observing her. A faint flush crept up her neck, staining her collarbone. She straightened her posture, attempting to project an aura of innocent grace. She tightened her grip on the bouquet of desert wildflowers, waiting for the clergyman to offer a traditional morning greeting or a prayer to diffuse the tension. Pastor Dave did not offer a prayer. He folded his hands in front of his waist. He looked at my sister with the stern, unforgiving gaze of a man accustomed to confronting moral decay. "Harper," the pastor said. His voice was a low, resonant boom that carried effortlessly to every corner of the vaulted room. "Is this your wedding dress?" The question was simple, stripped of any rhetorical flourish. It hung in the chilled air, demanding a binary answer. Harper's eyes darted toward Bryce, seeking a lifeline, but her fiancé remained immobilized by his own rising horror. She looked at her future in-laws standing by the vestibule. She calculated the optics. She realized she could not claim outright ownership with me standing 20 feet away, armed with a tracking application and an unyielding stare. Her survival instinct kicked in, defaulting to the fabricated narrative she and my mother constructed to justify the theft. "Well," she stammered, her melodic tone wavering under the intense scrutiny. Her voice sounded thin, lacking its usual performative confidence. "It is a family heirloom. We decided we are sharing it today. We thought it would be a beautiful way to honor our shared lineage before the guests arrive." The lie slipped from her lips, coated in a veneer of sentimental virtue. She attempted to transform a premeditated burglary into a touching display of sisterly unity. It was a masterful pivot, designed to make any further accusation seem petty and ungracious. In a normal social setting, the sheer audacity of the excuse would force the offended party to retreat, unwilling to cause a scene in front of wealthy spectators. Pastor Dave did not retreat. He absorbed the lie without a flicker of emotion. He unclasped his hands. "If it is a shared family heirloom," the clergyman replied, his tone dropping an octave, "then you will not mind if I read the family blessing sewn into the hem." Harper's face dropped. The counterfeit grace evaporated from her features, replaced by a mask of stark, unadulterated panic. Her jaw went slack. The bouquet of wildflowers trembled in her grip. "Sewn into the hem," she whispered. The words sounded hollow, as if the air had been vacuumed from her lungs. She looked down at the voluminous ivory skirt pooling around her designer heels. She had spent 2 hours parading in the garment, posing for high-definition cameras, entirely oblivious to the surveillance apparatus resting against her ankles. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed her. Pastor Dave did not wait for her permission. Despite his age and his formal attire, he moved with practiced agility. He dropped to one knee on the hard wooden step of the chancel. Harper instinctively shrank backward, pulling the silk tight against her legs. The movement was a futile, reflexive attempt to protect her stolen prize. Pastor Dave ignored her recoil. He reached out with large, weathered hands. He grasped the heavy folds of the vintage fabric, lifting the bottom tier of the skirt. His fingers traced the interior lining, searching for the structural anomaly I described to him moments earlier. He found the concealed seam. The sharp, metallic rasp of the industrial zipper opening cut through the quiet chapel. The sound was harsh, mechanical, and entirely out of place in a sanctuary draped in white protea and classical instruments. It was the auditory signature of a trap springing shut. Pastor Dave reached 2 fingers into the hidden cavity. He extracted the first item. He stood up slowly, bringing his hand into the morning light, filtering through the stained glass windows. He held up a circular, white electronic disc. The Apple AirTag caught the sunlight, gleaming like a piece of sterile modern evidence extracted from a historical artifact. He elevated it high enough for the florist, the photographer, and Bryce's parents to clearly identify the object. It was an undeniable piece of surveillance technology. An estate liquidator knows the psychological impact of irrefutable proof. When families dispute the ownership of a contested property, oral arguments are useless. The person who produces the signed, notarized deed ends the war instantly. Holding up the tracking device accomplished the same goal. It destroyed Harper's narrative. People do not install GPS trackers into shared family heirlooms. They install trackers into highly valuable assets they suspect a hostile party might attempt to steal. The presence of the device proved premeditation, ownership, and deep-seated distrust. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Bryce took a physical step away from the altar, his eyes locked on the white disc in the pastor's hand. The reality of the situation crashed into him. He was not marrying a vibrant digital creator. He was marrying a woman who required electronic surveillance to prevent her from robbing her own kin. Pastor Dave lowered his hand. He kept the tracking disc secured in his palm. He reached back into the concealed pocket in the ivory silk. He pulled out the waterproof plastic sleeve. The transparent casing protected a single sheet of faded cream stationery. The blue ink of my grandmother's angular cursive was clearly visible through the plastic. Pastor Dave held the document by the corner, treating it with the reverence reserved for a binding legal contract. Beverly snapped out of her paralyzed stupor. The matriarch recognized the lethal threat the document posed to her carefully constructed illusion. Written documentation is the natural enemy of the gaslighter. It cannot be spun, manipulated, or denied. It exists as an objective historical record. "Give that to me," Beverly demanded, her voice cracked, soaring into a frantic, shrill register. She lunged forward, her beige pump slipping dangerously on the polished wood. She reached out with both hands, her manicured fingers clawing at the air, desperate to snatch the plastic sleeve away from the clergyman. She intended to confiscate the evidence and destroy it before the words could be entered into the public record. Pastor Dave anticipated the interception. He simply stepped backward, executing a smooth, evasive pivot that removed the document from her reach. He utilized his broad shoulders to physically block her path. He cast a tall, imposing shadow over the frantic older woman. He looked down at her with a glare so stony and severe it stopped her in her tracks. Beverly froze her hands, hovering in the empty space, her chest heaving with exertion and terror. The sanctuary fell into a profound, suffocating silence. I remained leaning against the carved railing of the choir loft. My heart maintained a steady, even rhythm. The adrenaline flush was gone, replaced by the cool, pristine satisfaction of a perfectly executed liquidation. I did not have to scream. I did not have to tear the vintage fabric. I did not have to throw a single punch. I utilized the tools of my trade. I secured the asset, I laid the groundwork, and I let the thieves trigger their own demise on a public stage. The trap snapped shut with devastating precision. Harper was trapped inside the stolen couture, anchored to the altar, surrounded by witnesses who now understood the exact nature of her character. The social currency she coveted was currently evaluating her with unmasked disgust. The false weapon of loud, chaotic vengeance was entirely unnecessary. The surgical strike severed the toxic vein with a clean, irreversible cut. The only task remaining was the reading of the final verdict. Pastor Dave slid his thumb and index finger into the waterproof casing. The crinkle of the thick plastic echoed in the silent sanctuary, a sharp, synthetic noise cutting through the historical reverence of the adobe walls. He pinched the corner of the faded cream stationery and extracted it from the sleeve. The paper was brittle, carrying the faint, enduring scent of dried cedar and old ink. It was a tangible piece of history, preserved specifically for this exact reckoning. The clergyman unfolded the letter. He did not rush. He smoothed the creases with deliberate care, pressing the paper flat against the palm of his hand. He adjusted his stance, planting his dress shoes firmly on the wooden chancel. He looked down at the angular cursive. When he finally spoke, his voice possessed the cadence of a judge reading a final, unappealable verdict. "To my dearest Amelia Pastor," Dave read aloud. The name struck the air like a physical blow. It bounced off the vaulted ceiling and washed over the front pews. It severed Harper's fabricated narrative of a shared family heirloom at the root. The letter did not offer a vague blessing to the women of the lineage. It was a targeted, specific inheritance. The pastor continued reading, his tone steady and resolute. "Only you have the quiet strength and the pure heart to carry this family legacy forward. The loud ones will always demand the spotlight, but the resilient ones build the foundation. Wear this dress with my blessing because you earned it. Protect your peace." He lowered the stationery. He did not add his own commentary. He did not need to interpret the text for the audience. My grandmother had drafted an airtight legal document from the grave, identifying the toxicity in her own bloodline and providing her chosen heir with the exact tool required to defeat it. Harper looked as though the floorboards had turned to ash beneath her designer heels. The vintage Dior silk draping her hips suddenly morphed from a stolen prize into a straitjacket. Her skin flushed a deep, blotchy crimson. She opened her mouth, searching for a defense, a deflection, or a tearful excuse to mitigate the damage. Her usual arsenal of manipulation failed her. You cannot gaslight a handwritten letter bearing a dead woman's signature. Pastor Dave stepped forward, closing the distance between the pulpit and the altar. He extended his right hand toward my sister. He held the Apple AirTag between his fingers. "Tracking devices do not belong in shared family heirlooms, Harper," he stated. His voice lacked any trace of pastoral warmth. It was pure, unyielding iron. They belong on stolen property. He dropped the electronic disc. It fell through the empty space and landed squarely in the palm of her trembling hand. The lightweight plastic hardware felt heavier than a stone anvil. It was the physical manifestation of her own guilt, handed back to her in front of the very audience she intended to impress. Bryce stood 2 feet away from his fiancée. Throughout the entire ordeal, the club promoter had maintained a posture of bewildered passivity. He was a man accustomed to the superficial drama of the nightlife industry, where arguments revolved around velvet ropes and bar tabs. He was entirely unprepared for the depth of pathology currently unspooling in the morning light. He looked at the white tracking disc resting in Harper's palm. He looked at the vintage silk she wore, a garment she pilfered from her own sister's closet while the bride slept. He looked past the altar, his gaze landing on his parents standing near the baptismal font. The affluent couple from Paradise Valley did not look outraged. They looked disgusted. They viewed the spectacle not as a tragedy, but as a severe lapse in pedigree and basic human decency. They recognized that they were standing in a room with grifters. Bryce's mother offered her son a single, tight shake of her head. It was a silent, maternal command to evacuate a sinking vessel. Bryce turned his attention back to Harper. The illusion of the vibrant, glamorous influencer shattered, revealing the hollow, calculating parasite underneath. He realized he was not an equal partner in her life. He was a prop, recruited to fund her lifestyle and legitimize her status. If she possessed the capacity to rob her own sister on the morning of her wedding, she possessed the capacity to ruin him. Harper reached out her fingers, grazing the sleeve of his tailored tuxedo. "Bryce," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy plea. "Please, let me explain." Bryce flinched, pulling his arm away as if her touch carried an electric current. The revulsion on his face was raw and unguarded. He reached up to his left lapel. His fingers grasped the stem of the white desert rose pinned to his jacket. It was the boutonniere selected to match the bridal bouquet she currently held. He unpinned the flower. He did not throw it. He did not offer a dramatic speech. He simply opened his hand and let the blossom fall. It hit the wooden chancel with a soft, dismissive thud. Bryce turned his back on the altar. He walked down the side aisle, heading straight toward the arched exit door leading to the courtyard. His strides were long fueled by the desperate need to put physical distance between himself and the toxic epicenter of the room. Bryce Harper screamed. The sound tore out of her throat, a harsh, jagged shriek that lacked any of her usual curated elegance. It was the genuine sound of a narcissist losing their primary source of social validation. She took a step forward, attempting to chase after him. The heavy architectural structure of the 1970s couture stopped her. The vintage skirt was tailored to my measurements, designed for a deliberate, measured walk. It was not built for a frantic sprint. The heavy silk twisted around her ankles, binding her legs. She stumbled, her stiletto heel catching on the delicate, tatted lace she had tried to ruin weeks earlier. She caught herself on the communion rail, gasping for air, watching her future disappear through the heavy wooden door. Bryce did not look back. He pushed the exit open and stepped out into the Arizona sun. The door swung shut behind him, sealing his departure with a heavy, definitive click. Beverly collapsed into the front pew. The matriarch buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with loud, theatrical sobs. She did not cry because she felt remorse for stealing my security. She did not weep for the pain she caused her eldest daughter. She cried because the social currency she worshipped was bankrupt. The wealthy in-laws witnessed the grift. The engagement was over. The charade was dead. She was sitting in a rented church, stripped of her dignity, exposed as the architect of her own family's ruin. The collateral damage rippled through the remaining vendors. The professional photographer hired by Bryce's parents to document the fraudulent cover shoot recognized the session was terminated. He did not ask for payment. He silently collapsed his heavy tripod, twisting the metal locks with rapid, squeaking turns. He capped his expensive lens, slung his equipment bag over his shoulder, and quietly slipped out the back doors, eager to escape the radioactive fallout. The floral designer retreated into the vestibule, giving the altar a wide berth. Even the string quartet began packing their instruments into their velvet-lined cases. I remained leaning against the railing of the choir loft. I watched the dust settle over the ruins of my family. The surgical strike had executed with flawless precision. There were no viral videos of a screaming bride. There were no police sirens. There was only the cold, hard truth laid bare in the morning light. Harper remained anchored to the chancel step. She stood entirely alone. The vintage Dior gown, the item she coveted and stole to secure her own triumph, hung heavily on her frame. It offered no comfort. It provided no glory. It was a beautiful ivory prison. She looked down at the white tracking disc still resting in her palm. The digital pulse it emitted was invisible, but the message it conveyed was permanent. She had taken the vendor. She had taken the dress. She had taken the spotlight. And in doing so, she had orchestrated her own spectacular, inescapable isolation. The sanctuary of the historic chapel felt like an abandoned museum. The air hung stagnant, thick with the scent of wilted white protea and the bitter tang of panic. The morning sunlight continued to pour through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant geometric patterns across the flagstone floor. But the warmth of the day could not penetrate the cold reality settling over the altar. My sister stood frozen on the chancel step. She looked down at the tracking device resting in her palm, her chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. The vintage ivory silk, the prize she had conspired to steal in the dead of night, now hung upon her frame like a shroud. She looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, stripped of their usual arrogance, pleading for a lifeline. She wanted me to engage. She wanted me to demand the garment back. She needed a confrontation to transform her humiliation into a shared conflict. If we fought, she could spin the narrative. If we fought, she could share the blame. I denied her the privilege of a war. An estate liquidator understands a fundamental truth about contaminated assets. When a beautiful piece of antique furniture sits in a flooded basement for too long, the water damage seeps into the wood. The rot travels deep beneath the surface. You can sand the exterior, you can apply a fresh coat of expensive varnish, but the structural integrity is permanently compromised. The item will eventually crumble. You do not bring a rotting asset into a new home. You cut your losses and you walk away. I looked at my grandmother's dress. I remembered the hours I spent coordinating the restoration. I remembered the $3,400 I paid to revive the fabric. But looking at the silk draped over the woman who stole it, the sentimental value evaporated. The heirloom was contaminated. It no longer represented my grandmother's quiet strength. It represented my mother's betrayal and my sister's boundless entitlement. I walked down the wooden steps of the choir loft. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. I bypassed the front pew where Beverly sat sobbing into her hands. The older woman reached out her fingers, grasping blindly toward the fabric of my jeans, begging for a reconciliation she had not earned. I sidestepped her reach without breaking my stride. I stopped at the edge of the chancel, leaving 5 feet of empty space between my boots and my sister's designer heels. "Keep the dress, Harper," I said. My voice was even devoid of any anger or sorrow. It carried the sterile, professional tone of a manager finalizing a severance package. "Consider it my final payment. You are both evicted from my life." Harper flinched. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She realized I was not offering a generous gift. I was severing the bloodline. By leaving the Dior gown in her possession, I was denying her the opportunity to ever play the victim again. Every time she looked at the heavy silk, she would remember the morning she stood abandoned at the altar, holding a tracking disc, while her wealthy fiancé walked out the door in disgust. The dress was no longer a trophy. It was a monument to her ruin. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the altar. I began the long walk down the center aisle. My heavy leather boots clicked against the stone pavers, establishing a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the silent chapel. With every step I took toward the vestibule, a profound physical weight lifted from my shoulders. For 10 years, I had carried the invisible burden of their financial survival. I had navigated their manufactured crises, absorbed their insults, and paid the ransom demands of their hostage situation. I was leaving all of it behind on the altar. Lucas waited for me near the heavy wooden exit doors. He had watched the entire surgical strike from the shadows. He did not ask if I was okay. He looked at my face, read the pristine clarity in my eyes, and offered a soft, genuine smile. He extended his right hand. I placed my hand in his. His grip was warm and solid. We pushed the heavy doors open together, stepping out of the shadowed vestibule and into the brilliant baking heat of the Arizona morning. We climbed into the cabin of his heavy-duty pickup truck. Lucas shifted the transmission into drive. We left the historic chapel in the rearview mirror, navigating the winding asphalt roads that led deep into the remote canyons of Sedona. We drove for miles, rolling the windows down, letting the dry desert wind rush through the cabin. The scent of pine and sagebrush replaced the suffocating perfume of my past. We did not cancel our wedding day. We simply relocated the venue to a place where toxicity could not follow. Late that afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, we gathered at a private, unlisted canyon overlook. The red rock monoliths towered around us, glowing like embers in the twilight. We stood on a plateau of natural sandstone. The wind rustled through the juniper trees. I did not wear white silk. I wore my faded denim jeans, my crisp white button-down shirt, and my scuffed boots. Lucas stood before me in his tailored charcoal suit. Pastor Dave had followed us into the desert, bringing his worn leather Bible. A small, fiercely loyal circle of our closest friends stood in a semicircle around us. There were no professional photographers. There were no curated floral arches. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of the commitment we were making to one another. We spoke our vows as the sky bruised into shades of violet and copper. I looked into the eyes of the man who had taught me that love does not require a ransom. When Pastor Dave pronounced us husband and wife, the applause from our friends echoed across the vast, open expanse of the canyon. I had never felt more like a bride than I did in that exact moment, standing in the dirt, wearing my armor, holding the hand of my partner. The epilogue of the Alexander family unspooled exactly as a liquidator would predict. Bryce never returned to the chapel. He permanently called off the engagement before the sun set that evening. His parents ensured the news circulated through their affluent social circles, effectively exiling Harper from the high society network she had tried so desperately to infiltrate. Without the Bank of Amelia to cover the shortfalls, the financial reality of their lifestyle caught up to them with brutal speed. I had permanently revoked my status as their guarantor. I blocked their phone numbers, blocked their email addresses, and instructed my property manager to turn them away if they ever approached my warehouse. Within 6 months, the eviction notices arrived. Harper and Beverly could not maintain the lease on their luxury apartment without my silent monthly subsidies. They lost the granite countertops the aesthetic coffee shop runs, and the designer handbags. They were forced to downsize to a cramped, unglamorous complex on the outskirts of the city, learning for the first time in a decade what it meant to survive on their own merit. I never looked back. I poured my newly reclaimed energy and financial resources into my own future. My estate liquidation firm expanded rapidly. I leased a second warehouse. I hired a team of dedicated appraisers. I built a thriving, lucrative enterprise from the ground up, utilizing the same meticulous focus that had allowed me to dismantle my sister's theft. If you are currently acting as the human shield for a family that resents you, hear this. You cannot fix a broken foundation by pouring your own blood into the cracks. Some structures are meant to fall. You do not owe your sanity to people who view your boundaries as an insult to their entitlement. You have the right to pack up your tools, walk out the front door, and let gravity do the talking. Thank you for tuning in to Aura Vengeance. Subscribe to the channel, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.